It's a terrific privilege to be able to stand in this House to speak on this final report from the Joint Select Committee on the Constitutional Recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I should, at the outset, repeat my acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose traditional country we gather here, and recognise indeed those from my own hometown of Newcastle, the Awabakal and Worimi peoples. And I guess seek to draw on their millennia of wisdom as we in this parliament try to come to grips with a 200+ year history, colonial history, and how indeed we might best shape a pathway for the nation to indeed land in a place where constitutional recognition becomes a lived reality. I would like to thank at the outset all of the participating members of this committee. I know that it was an enormous task, but I must say we probably had the brightest and most committed minds in this parliament put their hands up to undertake this enormous task, and certainly the model of actually having co-chairs in this community rather than the traditional chair being from a government member and the opposition getting the deputy chair position. I do pay tribute to those that were able to seek agreement around having co-chairs in this instance, where Senator Patrick Dodson, obviously in opposition from the Senate side, and Mr Julian Lesser from the House of Reps and in government, together, formed a genuine partnership. And indeed, in many ways, this is a model for what is going to be required for the nation to be able to implement the recommendations of this report. I'd also like to acknowledge the member for Barton who participated here, Senator Mullindiri McCarthy, and the member for Lingiari who just spoke earlier, being the Labor members, but there were crossbench members in the member for Indi, who is here in the chamber as well, Green Senator Rachel Seward and Senator Amanda Stoker, Jonathan Dunham, and on the House of Reps side, Dr John McVie and Susan Lay, who was there for a period of time, I think, though, Mr Lou O'Brien. It was an enormous task. It had a lot of travelling across Australia in order to be able to achieve their goals. And as the member for Brand spoke earlier on, she and I were incredibly privileged to be at the Barunga Festival at the time when the Joint Committee was hosting its meeting with the 4 land councils just prior to the Barunga Festival. And that was enormously insightful for all of us that were able to be there on that occasion. These are men and women who have spent literally decades of their lives thinking about these issues of, facing of contested histories in Australia, of how you might remedy some of those injustices that have occurred, and how, participating in very deep and thoughtful constitutional matters in discussion in this community. It really should come as no surprise that First Nations people might lead us in these sorts of discussions, because it is such a part of their lived reality having to deal with these discrepancies in the Constitution, and they feel the very real impacts of the inadequacies of the Constitution as it currently is drafted probably more deeply than most. So it's of no surprise that the Barunga Festival, or the meeting with the land councils prior to the festival would be so illuminating, and people brought great knowledge, humour, love and good faith and intention to those discussions, and I really pay tribute to all of the senior men and women there who really opened up yet again their hearts and minds to try and make the rest of us understand what the very real implications of these matters were for everyday life for First Nation peoples. So I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, what it's really hit home for me in reading this report and reflecting on just one of those meetings that I attended there at Barunga is how critical it is the way in which this parliament now responds. You know, at Barunga, people were reminded of it was 30 years ago they were promised a treaty. And we failed. We totally failed as a nation to live up to that ask and indeed that expectation. And I don't want to be standing here, well, I possibly won't be here in 30 years, Deputy Speaker, but I don't want the next member for Newcastle or anyone else in the next generation standing in this parliament still calling for a remedy of the injustices that took place in this nation, and we've never actually faced, squarely enough to find real lasting solutions. So I think that that this report, in fact, really does open up a pathway is critical. You can be assured that every First Nations man, woman and kid is going to be looking to this parliament now and looking at us very closely as to how we conduct ourselves and what course of action we take, because I've got to say there will be, for many people, it will be a case of action speaking louder than words. They've heard it all before in some cases. So I think that this report puts the voice firmly back on the national agenda, and that is a good thing. Because even though the voice, as recommended by the Uluru Statement, might have taken many of us by surprise in terms of the ask of the nation, that is what very, very close and detailed consultations amongst First Nations people came up with. This was the priority, having a voice. So I think that there are certainly still some live issues around whether how we enable all of those regional and local voices to be part of the process of establishing a national voice. I think that will be really critical, but this does provide some important sort of first stepping stones in that process. Make no mistake, Labor remains utterly committed to all elements arising from the Statement of the Heart from Uluru. And we will continue to work with First Nation peoples for a voice in Parliament, for a constitutional entrenchment of that voice, which is critical, and for a truth-telling and agreement-making process. These are high-order issues, high priorities for Labor. And it should be of no surprise to anyone the significance of truth-telling and agreement-making in this parliament. It is a vital part of the reconciliation process where we as a nation confront or, as I said, face squarely the fact that there are contested histories about our nation. And we need to understand that history of injustice as experienced by First Nations. That has to be acknowledged. That has to be an important part of that process, and that's why the truth-telling is critical. I hope that everyone in this place takes very, very seriously the obligation that is now before us to act, to have a very meaningful, purposeful and thoughtful response to this report. I am pleased that the voice, notwithstanding some differences in this House, that the voice is firmly back on the agenda. Co-designing with First Nations people at local, regional and national level is critical to get this right. Thank you very much.